Kravis's introduction into the bidding of PIC preferred stock, which represented a full $11 a share, or nearly $2.5 billion of his $90 bid, was a masterstroke Shearson couldn't easily equal. 2 years of backing Dan Good's corporate raiders had left Cohen's junk bond department sadly lacking in the expertise it now needed. The worldwide market for PIC stock, which is convertible into junk bonds, then stood about $2.5 billion. Kravis's offer would easily double its size. That kind of confidence didn't come overnight. As hard as he tried, Tom Hill couldn't see how the market could absorb much more than $5 a share. Later, he would revise that number to $8 a share. For the moment, Cohen put off dealing with Forstmann. Already, Forstmann was pestering him with calls. "We have to move fast. Do you think Kravis is waiting around?" It was impossible to talk with the man without enduring 20 minutes of why Kravis was ruining the world. Bringing Solomon into the deal as a full partner topped Cohen's list of priorities Wednesday morning. Johnson slept late that day, then hustled down to Shearson's offices in Battery Park City to meet with Cohen and the Solomon chieftains, Gutfriend and Strauss. Afterward, Cohen asked Johnson for permission to bring Solomon into the fold. "I have to rely on you for this," Johnson asked. "What do they bring to the party?" "They bring a lot to the party," Cohen replied. "Principally, $3 billion in capital. The bidding was reaching heights where the equity alone was more than Shearson could safely assemble itself. If Johnson's team won, Solomon could also prove valuable in the critical sale of bonds to finance the bid." "Any objections to them coming in?" Cohen asked. "No, not at all," Johnson said. "And you need the money." If Forstmann Little and Shearson were to join forces, a lot of work had to be done. That evening, Nick Forstmann strode across Grand Army Plaza to RJR Nabisco's offices to begin what he hoped would be a profitable partnership. Nicky Forstmann, 8 years his brother's junior, movie star handsome and well-tanned year-round, shared his brother's distaste for junk bonds and Henry Kravis. He was walking toward 9 West's glass-enclosed lobby when he spotted Kravis and Roberts inside, coming toward him. Kravis saw Forstmann and smiled. He knew where Nicky was going. As Forstmann entered the revolving doors, Kravis suddenly held them, temporarily trapping the younger man. Kravis wore a wide smile. He loved toying with his rivals. Released a moment later, a red-faced Forstmann stepped into the lobby. "What are you doing here, Nicky?" Kravis chided him. "What do you want to be involved in this thing for?" Kravis snickered as he watched Forstmann head for an elevator bank far from the one to Johnson's floor. Kravis thought he was trying to throw them off. "He should know better than that," Kravis said, smiling. On Wednesday evening, Johnson emceed a benefit honoring Charlie Hugel as Boys Club's Man of the Year. Johnson had worked with the charity since his early years in New York. He had suggested Hugel for the award. Johnson was the perfect dinner speaker, cracking jokes and needling Hugel, the man whose committee would determine the future of Johnson's buyout effort. A number of those involved in the deal were there: John Grennis and Jim Welch from RJR Nabisco, Ira Harris of Lazard Frere, Marty Davis of Gulf and Western. "Welcome to the special committee meeting," Johnson said, opening the dinner. Afterward, Johnson retired to Jim and Linda Robinson's apartment, where the two men talked late into the night. Looking down on the city below, Johnson, a drink cradled in his hand, enjoyed a moment of rest. He hadn't been comfortable bidding in the low 80s. Now that they were looking at bids in the low 90s, he was having a hard time generating enthusiasm for the work. At those levels, the debt payments would be crushing. Atlanta, Premier, the apartments, the planes. He shuddered to think. If winning meant giving up everything he loved about corporate life, he would rather lose. "How high is this thing going?" Johnson wondered aloud. "We're talking serious money here now. Jimmy, basically, the business can only produce what the business can produce. No matter how good it is, if you pay too much, you'll lose." When Johnson had shared his fears with Steve Goldstone, the lawyer had tried to break the truth about Shearson to him gently. "Ross, it's their money," Goldstone said. "If they want to spend it, let them spend it." Now, As he sipped his drink and hashed out things with Jim Robinson, Johnson couldn't shake the feeling he was losing control of his great adventure. "Jimmy," he asked the chairman of American Express, "how much insanity is there?" Plenty. As Johnson's troubled mind wound down, a scene of minor chaos was being played out at RJR Nabisco's 48th floor offices. There, investment bankers from Shearson and Solomon met with Nick Forsman and a Goldman Sachs team led by Jeff Boise. After a month of work, Tom Hill had definite notions about how to proceed, about what businesses should be sold, about what Johnson would and wouldn't do. Boise, it was clear, had his own ideas. More assets should be sold off, he said, and quicker. Hill rattled. The two bankers' voices took on edges, and soon sparks were flying. Nick Forsman could tell the room wasn't big enough for both bankers' egos. Boise was trying to bully Hill, and Hill was threatened that a competitor was trying to run his deal. Forsman rose and took Hill aside. "Look, Tom," he said, "this thing is not a turf issue, all right? It's about how we can get this thing done. Forget the intramural squabbling," Forsman suggested. Later, when Forsman took the elevator down with Boise, it was clear the Goldman banker was incensed by the ex parte conversation with Hill. "What did you do that for?" Boise demanded. "What did you tell him?" Forsman had no patience for investment bankers' macho mind games. "Jeff, this is not a turf thing," he repeated. "The idea is to get the deal done." Thursday morning, Tom Strauss was in John Gutfreund's Art Deco office off Solomon's trading floor, talking with a pair of his investment bankers about RJR Nabisco. Gutfreund had flown to Madrid the night before to open a branch office, leaving Strauss the senior Solomon executive on the deal. The takeover game was new to Strauss, a man who made his career trading government bonds. Most days he sat near Gutfreund in a desk on the trading floor. There, among the shouting men moving billions of dollars in bonds, Strauss felt most at home. These days he was relying heavily on his banker's advice. Gutfreund's phone rang. "It's Henry Kravis," a secretary said. Before Strauss could take the call, a second line rang. It was Gutfreund himself calling from Europe. Strauss hollered that he would take Gutfreund's call first. He picked up the phone expecting to hear the chairman's gruff voice, but instead heard Henry Kravis. Somehow he had picked up the wrong line. Before Kravis said a word, Strauss knew it would be an unpleasant conversation. The two men had known each other for 20 years, but these days their friendship was strained. In the 1970s, Tom and Bonnie Strauss had been close friends of Henry and Hetty Kravis. When Henry divorced Hetty, says one of Strauss's closest friends, Tom and Bonnie lived through the whole thing. They stayed close with Hetty. When Henry remarried, there was a break. As a result, the friend says, Henry felt betrayed by Tom and Bonnie. In hindsight, Strauss acknowledged the breach, saying, "It's natural for the wives to stay close in these things." He downplayed its effect on his performance in the RJR Nabisco deal, saying, "I think Henry's too big for that." Friends of both men disagree. The tension between Strauss and Kravis was to have an effect on several of the deal's key negotiations. When the deal was over, a lot of broken friendships were mended, says one observer, but the relationship between Tom and Henry will never be the same. That morning, Kravis wanted something from his old friend, Tommy Strauss. He was smooth and conciliatory, every inch the old pal. "Tom, I understand you all are thinking about getting in the middle of this thing," Kravis began. "I'd appreciate your not doing that. We're good friends, and I'd sure like it if you didn't complicate things." Strauss couldn't believe Kravis's gall. RJR Nabisco represented Solomon's best chance yet to make the leap into merchant banking. And hadn't Kravis just hired 4 separate investment banks for the deal, not one of them Solomon? Strauss's irritation went beyond RJR Nabisco, of course. KKR had shit on Solomon for years, recalled Chaz Phillips. They've given out $500 million of investment banking fees, and Solomon's gotten about 1% of it. And what Solomon got, the others didn't want. Strauss was too much of a gentleman to curse Kravis that morning. "This looks like a transaction that makes a lot of sense for us, Henry," he said briskly. "It doesn't preclude our doing something with you." Strauss beat a retreat as fast as he could. Goodfriend was still holding on the other line. "Ingrate," Kravis said to himself, putting down the phone. Here he had channeled several major projects to Solomon in recent years, and Strauss wouldn't give him the time of day. Strauss wouldn't even afford him the courtesy of a call before entering battle against him. Kravis tried to put it out of his mind. He had more important things to worry about. His tender offer would officially begin the next day, Friday. It wouldn't be long, Kravis knew, until Cohen and Johnson regrouped and put their own bid on the table. When that happened, Kravis would have to be ready to bid higher. Before he did, he needed to know a lot more about Johnson's company. And without Johnson in his camp, Kravis remained at a severe disadvantage. What he needed was someone who knew RJR Nabisco, a wise man. A few days earlier, he had taken a call from Jim Walter, founder of a Tampa company Kravis had acquired in 1987. Walter sat on the board of Anchor Glass with Tylee Wilson and suggested to Kravis that Wilson might be of help analyzing RJR Nabisco. Kravis hesitated. He didn't know Wilson. But as the week wore on and the chances of joining forces with Johnson diminished, he changed his mind. He now dialed Wilson in Jacksonville, Florida, where the former RJR chief had moved after his ouster. "Oh, I know he'll want to talk to you," Wilson's secretary said, promising that the executive would return the call immediately. Minutes later, Wilson ducked out of an American Heritage Board meeting to return Kravis's call. "Maybe we could get together," Kravis said after introducing himself. "It could make sense." "That's great," Wilson said. A meeting was arranged for Friday morning at 10 o'clock. Smith Bagley wasn't easily moved to rage. The most prominent member of the R.J. Reynolds family's scattered remnants, he was an affable patrician who moved comfortably in the civilized circles of Georgetown salons and Nantucket beach houses. He compensated for his imposing 6'6" height by walking slow, talking slow, and stooping slightly so it seemed as not to alarm anyone. His hair, just now turning to gray, was perennially tousled like a schoolboy's. But now Bagley was mad. As the grandson of R.J. Reynolds and the owner of more than 1 million shares of RJR stock, he saw himself as the inheritor of the Reynolds family mantle. Damned if he was going to sit by and watch Ross Johnson steal the company his family worked so hard to build. Wednesday afternoon, Bagley strode around his lawyer's office, waving his arms and violating the dignified hush of Arnold & Porter's Washington office. "Those little bastards, those little managers," Bagley shouted. "This little guy could take the company from the shareholders to make all that money for himself. That money belongs to the shareholders. It's so wrong. We have to do something." But what? Until now, Smith Bagley hadn't exactly taken an active interest in the company. He had grown up in Greenwich, Connecticut, a few doors down from Ted Forstman's family. He hadn't cared much for Winston-Salem, which he considered a cultural backwater. For much of his life, Bagley had steered clear of the business world. His experiences in it hadn't been pleasant. In the 70s, he headed a company named Washington Group, but it wound up in bankruptcy proceedings, and Bagley in court charged with stock manipulation. Acquitted, Bagley became a philanthropist, active in the affairs of foundations that used the proceeds from their RJR stock. He had been president of the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation. He was also vice chairman of the Democratic National Committee's Finance Committee, and, as such, in the thick of the final weeks of the Dukakis presidential campaign. Johnson's power grab couldn't have come at a worse time. But Bagley was determined to derail him. It was, he felt, his duty as a Reynolds. His mother, Nancy Reynolds, RJ's third child, had cared deeply for the company long after severing formal ties to it. In the early 70s, she had fought a proposal to take Reynolds out of the company name, writing letters to board members that said, in effect, "over my dead body." In the mid-1980s, she pressured Tylee Wilson's people to publish an authoritative company history that had been gathering dust for 20 years. Some had thought the book a bit too authoritative and suppressed it, but Nancy Reynolds lived to see it published in 1985, the year she died. Like his mother, Bagley made it a point to get together with the company's reigning chief executive from time to time to talk. He had lunched with Tylee Wilson about once a year and liked him. After a year of trying to arrange a meeting, Bagley had finally met Johnson at the Democratic National Convention that summer. He wasn't impressed. "That bastard," Bagley cried now. "He moved the company to Atlanta, and now he's cashing out." But what to do? Bagley had already conferred with a lawyer in Winston-Salem about blocking the LBO legally, but was told he had a better chance of organizing a competing bidding group. Now he sorted through the possibilities with Arnold and Porter lawyers. RJR Nabisco employees and retirees held maybe 5% of the stock. Could they be rallied into an anti-Johnson bloc? Possibly, the lawyer said. What about the family? Reynolds' family members controlled another 5 to 8%. The idea of marshalling those shares into a family-backed bid appealed to Bagley, although he knew it would never happen. Aside from the dabblings of Bagley and his mother, the family hadn't been active in the company's affairs for decades. Bagley didn't want the company sold at all, although he confessed to mixed feelings as he watched the stock soar. But if it were to be sold, he wanted it to be at the best price for shareholders, not at the best price for Johnson. In that regard, Johnson's publicly disclosed flirtation with Henry Kravis was downright scary. Bagley had met Kravis years before and had a favorable impression of him. If he could bring Kravis the imprimatur of the Reynolds family and the aid of a man who knew the company inside and out, could he forestall a sweetheart deal with Johnson? It was a long shot, but Bagley had little to lose. He returned to his office and quickly got through to Kravis in New York. "What are you up to?" Bagley wondered. "Well, I'm doing some work with the family company," Kravis said, and they agreed to meet for breakfast on Saturday in New York. Next, Bagley called his friend Tylee Wilson in Jacksonville. "Look, we've got to get involved in this," Bagley said. "Would you have any interest in seeing me and my lawyer?" Was Tylee Wilson interested? The man who had sat atop a $15 billion corporation now ran two things, a one-man consulting firm and a faltering marina. For 2 years, Wilson had taken phone calls from his old corporate allies whispering about Johnson's latest escapades. It galled Tylee Wilson to see that breezy playboy trashing a fine American company. Wilson had come to rationalize his sacking as a principled refusal on his part to play corporate politics with the board. "I wouldn't kiss their ass in Macy's window," he told friends. He had used a portion of his severance pay to buy a new boat he named the Integrity. Now the folly of installing Johnson had been laid bare. It gave him some grim satisfaction. It would give him a lot more satisfaction to ride back in, the man given up for dead, and save the kingdom from this corrupt reign. Was Tylee Wilson interested? So bad he could taste it. "How about tomorrow?" he asked Bagley. Bagley agreed. There was just one logistical question. "Will you have a limo?" Wilson asked. Sure," Bagley replied. Bagley and his lawyer flew to Jacksonville the next day, arriving en limo at 6. Wilson greeted them in shirt sleeves and a tie and, it being cocktail hour, asked if they would like a drink. A few minutes later, Kravis called to say he would send a jet for Wilson in the morning. That night, the two men dined at Wilson's club, and Bagley got an earful from RJR's former chief. Wilson went on and on about the waste under the Johnson regime. The words appalling and sickening were used a lot. "It's a great company with great traditions that's being run down," he said. "Kravis needs you as a credible manager," Bagley said. "You could give him the management, and I could give him the family. We could beat Johnson." An alliance was formed. That night, Bagley returned to Wilson's house, where Tylee's wife, Pat, joined them. Into the night, they drank and swapped old Reynolds' war stories. Wouldn't it be great, they mused, to strap on the guns again? Friday morning, as he waited for Wilson to arrive in New York, Kravis was startled to read in the Wall Street Journal that Kohlberg Kravis had hired Wilson as a special consultant. "Where the hell could this have come from?" he asked Roberts. Neither man had a clue. As far as they knew, Wilson was already on a jet heading north. The airplane pilot, maybe? Kravis and Roberts were still puzzling over the leak when a call came in from Charlie Hugel. Kravis put him on the speakerphone. Hugel had just read of Wilson's hiring, too. "Henry," Hugel said, "if you're really going to do that, let me tell you one thing. Don't. If you do, everybody will quit. They'll go right out the door. If you're worried about management, there's a lot of good people in this company. I'll even help you find them. But you're making a big mistake hiring Tylee Wilson." Kravis thanked Hugel for the tip. Later that morning, he and Roberts met with Wilson for 2 hours. They found his knowledge of the company outdated and his zest for revenge apparent. The leak, they concluded, had come from Wilson himself. Leaks. Kravis was sick of them and wanted no part of a chief executive who wasn't. When Wilson left, Kravis and Roberts quickly made up their minds to wash their hands of the man. Tylee Wilson's career as a Kohlberg Kravis consultant was over before it started. Thursday afternoon, Peter Cohen slipped into a limousine and swung by to pick up Tom Strauss for a trip uptown to see Ted Forsman. Solomon had agreed to join the Shearson Group as a 50-50 partner. An announcement would go out that afternoon. On the way uptown, Strauss related in mock wonder his call from Kravis. Ushered into Forsman's office, Cohen strolled about, inspecting its motley collection of art, family photos, and books. Forsman realized Shearson's chairman was sizing up the place. As a chance to make new friends, the gathering was a failure. Forsman, impatient to join the fight, spent much of the time preaching against Kravis. Strauss thought Forsman would never get off the soapbox. Jeff Boise was also there. Tom Hill had passed his suspicions about the Goldman dealmaker on to Cohen. Boise and his people had shown a keen interest, too keen, Hill thought, in obtaining confidential information about Nabisco businesses. Hill didn't know about Boise's contacts with Procter & Gamble and others, but suspected the Goldman banker had other interests at work than strictly advising Forsman. Already Hill had directed his people not to share too much of their data with their Goldman counterparts. For his part, Cohen hadn't appreciated Boise's bullying style during their first meeting on Tuesday. Now he quizzed the banker about his job as Forsman's advisor. When Boise seemed to equivocate, Cohen realized Hill could be right. Boise might be playing along just to get his hands on information that would aid a Goldman-led bidding group. Cohen and Strauss left Forsman's office that day, deeply suspicious of Jeff Boise's motives. Friday morning, Boise read the news as his chauffeur-driven car nosed through Manhattan traffic on the way in from his Long Island home. The papers were full of what a great partner Solomon would make for Shearson, but there wasn't a single mention of Forsman Little. Coming after the fiasco Tuesday night, to Boise, it was more evidence that his client was being treated shabbily. From the car phone, he dialed Forsman, waking him from a sound sleep. It was time to talk to Cohen. "We better let this guy know absolutely that they're not treating us correctly," he told Forsman. "This guy's looking at you as financing. He uses the word partner, but he doesn't know what being a partner means. It's time they know how you treat a partner." Cohen was at home, pulling on his overcoat and heading for the front door when the phone rang. He jogged into the kitchen to get it, and immediately heard the steel in Boise's voice. "Teddy doesn't have to do anything here, Peter," he said. "Unless this thing starts going in the right direction, we can just walk away. You know, you're losing this guy. Don't be sitting there thinking he doesn't have any alternatives, because he does. We are perfectly capable of helping him." "What are you saying?" I'm saying we have alternative courses of action here if we don't do this deal with you. Whoa, Cohen said. You have alternative courses of action? What does that mean? Cohen knew exactly what that meant. Hill had been right. Goldman wanted to make a run at RJR Nabisco itself. To Cohen, the Goldman banker was a mole attempting to insinuate himself into the upper reaches of Shearson's strategists. Cohen, in his own words, went nuts. Listen, we don't need you, he told Boise. We don't need Teddy. We don't need anybody. We can go our own way too, you know. We've shared all our data, all our secrets with you. Now you're telling me you have alternative courses of action? That's absolutely 100% contrary to what you have told us to date. Cohen hung up, knowing it wouldn't be the last heated exchange he would have with the Goldman banker. Later that morning, Cohen called Forstmann, who was due at Shearson only a few hours later. Who are you going to bring down? Cohen asked. Forstmann ticked off his brother, Boise, and Steve Frayton, the owlish lawyer. Can't we do it without Boise? Gee, Peter, he's our advisor, you know. Well, all right, if you have to, but I don't need to get any more phone calls from this guy. I don't like the way he talks. Cohen was still fuming when the Forstmann group arrived at Shearson that afternoon. They took seats in its sumptuous 19th floor library, and turning to Boise, Cohen came right to the point. I want to know whether you guys have signed the confidentiality agreement, Cohen said. Are you free to go out on your own? Otherwise, I don't know how you can be sitting here in this room with us. No, Boise said, neither Forstmann Little nor Goldman has signed any such agreement. But Boise assured Cohen he had no intention of divulging any of Shearson's secrets. Peter, you have my word on that. I want to hear that from a lawyer. Boise stiffened. Let me understand, Peter. You're saying my word isn't good enough? I just want to hear it from a lawyer. Cohen turned to Frayton, who sat on a couch across from him. Hey, lawyer. Frayton, who was taking notes, didn't seem to hear him. Hey, you, lawyer, I'm talking to you. Frayton, blinking through his professor's glasses, looked up. He knew Cohen was trying to intimidate him. Are you talking to me? What's the question? Does the confidentiality agreement permit you to make an offer separate from management's? Frayton was silent for a moment. When he spoke, his tone was calm. I have two answers. First, I am not your lawyer. I would not presume to give you legal advice. You should ask your own attorneys that question. Ask Jack Nussbaum. He's a fine attorney. As regards the other, I have advised my client, of course, they are free to pursue another venture. Cohen showed no reaction. A minute later, he excused himself and left the room. Forstmann couldn't believe the exchange. Hey, you, lawyer? Who does this guy Cohen think he is? Little tough guy with that big cigar. A psychiatrist would love this guy. It was clear to Forstmann that Cohen was confused. Forstmann Little had signed a confidentiality agreement with RJR Nabisco, barring it from divulging any of the company's secret data. There was no such agreement with Shearson, nor with any member of the management group. Nor would there be. Cohen returned several minutes later with a set of photocopied computer runs. This is how we think a Shearson-Solomon-Forstmann Little offer would look, Cohen said, handing Forstmann a copy of the document. Forstmann leafed through it, but the numbers inside meant nothing to him. Everywhere he looked there were junk bonds, page after page of gobbledygook. Somewhere among the figures, he found Forstmann Little's $3 billion sandwiched between layers of junk bonds. It made his skin crawl. It got worse. It was clear Forstmann Little didn't control the bidding group, and the Shearson proposal seemed to contain clause after clause whose sole purpose was blocking that from ever happening. Cohen could tell Forstmann didn't like what he was reading. Don't think this is a hard and fast proposal, he said. We're perfectly willing to accommodate you on this. Forstmann was shaking his head. This won't work, he said. He tried to make Cohen understand that, under Forstmann Little's guidelines with its investors, the firm would end up controlling the bidding group. A full 37% of every Forstmann Little deal was promised to its lenders. Another 10 to 15% was sold to management. Even if they split the remaining 53%, Forsman and his backers would have majority control. Guidelines preventing that made no sense. No hard feelings, Peter, but this just won't work. That's all right, Cohen said. We'll just rework it. He got up and left the room. When Cohen left, Forsman turned to Boise. Jeff, what can we do about this? We can't even talk about this. You can't turn chicken shit into chicken salad. There's nothing to negotiate, you know? They just don't get it. The four men caucused. Maybe, they agreed, Forsman ought to propose his own capital structure to Shearson. Forsman thought it was a great idea. Besides, he was worn out from 48 hours of nonstop analysis. He rose and went looking for Cohen. He found him down the hall, chomping a cigar in a smoke-filled boardroom. Lawyers and investment bankers, clad in shirt sleeves, lined the walls. Peter, look, this is impossible, Forsman said. I'm exhausted. I'm going back uptown. We don't even have a starting point here. Let us put something together and send it down to you. Cohen agreed. Outside, Forsman and Boise climbed into the back seat of Forsman's black Mercedes. The two were already deep in conversation as the car pulled into traffic on the West Side Highway. Suddenly, Boise noticed Forsman's eyes widen. Forsman saw the oncoming car and wanted to yell, "Jeff, duck!" But it was too late. The Mercedes shuddered as a car plowed into its left rear end. No one was hurt in the fender bender, but the other driver had no insurance. They waited for what seemed like hours for a policeman to arrive. It just didn't seem like Ted Forsman's week. His Spanish outing a success, John Gutfriend had a terrible time returning to New York. His flight to Paris was diverted because of bad weather. He was offered a chance to land at Lyon, but turned it down. London was fogged in. Finally, the plane landed at Brussels. Gutfriend caught the 1:30 Sabena flight to New York, landing at Kennedy International a few minutes before 6. Clad in corduroy slacks and a sports shirt, Gutfriend boarded a helicopter arranged by Shearson and arrived at Solomon's Lower Wall Street headquarters in 15 minutes. There, he was met in the boardroom by a pair of advisors, Peter Darrow, his lanky longtime lawyer, and Mike Zimmerman, a fast-talking Solomon investment banker. In their hands were copies of Johnson's management agreement. "You're never going to believe this," Zimmerman said. Gutfriend took a copy and read it. He was startled. The agreement was far more lucrative than Cohen had hinted. If he was interpreting it correctly, Johnson's 7-man group was entitled to $1 billion, maybe more, free of charge. Darrow ran through the agreement with Gutfriend, point by point. It was important they realize what they had gotten themselves into. Arriving at Shearson a half-hour later, Gutfriend didn't wait long to bring up the management agreement with Cohen. "I am going to have an enormous amount of difficulty, and we as a team will have an enormous amount of difficulty unless that package can be reworked at a lower level," Gutfriend said. "Peter, it's just unseemly." "John, I promise you it will be dealt with," Cohen said. But, he added, it made little sense to revise the pact until they had a better sense of what levels the bidding might rise to. Relieved, Gutfriend agreed. It could wait. Teams of Shearson and Solomon bankers worked late into the night Friday and all day Saturday. Both firms mobilized traders and salesmen in London and Tokyo in the scramble to obtain funding commitments from an array of foreign banks. Another team, led by Jim Stern, was attempting to construct a compromise capital structure acceptable to Forsman. Cohen spent much of Saturday looking for Forsman. He called his office and his home. Forsman was at lunch, then he was out during the afternoon. Cohen knew he was getting the messages. All week, Forsman had bugged him to move faster, always faster. Now, when he was needed most, he couldn't be found. Cohen guessed Forsman was trying reverse psychology, playing hard to get. "He's just trying to act cute now," Cohen told Tom Strauss. As the phone messages from Cohen stacked up, Forsman ignored them. He took a long lunch, and that afternoon played tennis across the East River in Queens. Loping across the court, He reflected on Cohen and RJR Nabisco. He wasn't comfortable with the way this deal was going. I think we're out. We're wasting too much time. You think Kravis is wasting his time? We've got to move. As Forsman walked off the court, he couldn't shake the feeling that had plagued him for 3 days. As much as he wanted to whip Kravis, this didn't feel like a Forsman-Little deal. It's got to feel right. Forsman returned to his apartment to find the phone ringing. I've been trying to get you. The tone of Cohen's voice instantly conveyed his irritation. Cohen was saying something, but Forsman wasn't listening. I don't want to be on board with a guy like this. I don't like this guy. Why can't he be more like Jim Robinson? You're trying to make a hooker into a dream girl, Forsman told himself, and it just won't work. Peter, I got the messages, Forsman said, but I've been out all day. Cohen apologized for the misunderstanding. I've got some good news for you, he said. I'm out at Tommy Strauss's house. I really think we've figured out a way to accommodate your strictures. We can do this. I know we can. Cohen and Strauss had breezed into the Solomon executive's Armonk, New York home in the middle of an informal dinner party, and Cohen had ducked out to call Forsman. Forsman heard dogs barking and children giggling in the background. He heard someone, maybe Cohen, jokingly say, "Get that dog out of here." Forsman warmed to Cohen at that moment, chastising himself for so harshly judging the Shearson executive. This is more like it, Forsman thought. Dogs and kids. This is good. This is like a family. This is more like Forsman-Little. Cohen outlined a new capital structure to Forsman. Solomon and Shearson would each contribute 25% of the group's equity. Forsman-Little would take the remaining 50%. Control of the company would be split the same way, with Forsman-Little taking half. The proposal downplayed the junk bond aspects of the earlier proposal and promised Forsman-Little a greater voice in the future management of RJR. Just as important, Forsman-Little would receive senior debt rather than junior debt, roughly the difference between an American Express card and an IOU. How's that, Ted? Cohen asked. Forsman was genuinely surprised. Peter, that's a gigantic step forward, he said. That's great. Let's get together tomorrow, Cohen said. All evening, Forsman's people analyzed Cohen's proposal. It looked promising, they agreed. Forsman tracked down Boise at a Long Island dinner party after midnight and excitedly passed on the news. That evening, Forsman's partner, Brian Little, arrived in San Francisco after a Far Eastern vacation. Little had avidly followed the goings-on at RJR Nabisco at stops in Hong Kong, Thailand, and Bali. Soon after his plane touched down, he was on the phone with Forsman, who brought him up to date on the talks with Cohen. Little was immediately turned off by the idea of teaming up with Shearson. Geez, he said, this would be a real departure from anything we've done before, working with these guys. Little's reservations went deeper than balance sheets. He had known Cohen for a decade. The two men had weekend homes near each other in the Hamptons. Little thought Cohen represented the very worst of Wall Street, an abrasive, fee-hungry overreacher. He found the notion of working with the man repulsive. Teddy, Little said, the guy's a thug. Forsman assured him the deal they were considering would be a Forsman-Little deal. But Brian Little still couldn't generate any enthusiasm for the partnership, and before hanging up, aimed at Cohen the ultimate insult a Forsman-Little partner could muster. I'd almost rather be in business with Henry Kravis. Most U.S. companies employ spokespeople who are paid to parrot the company line, whether it be on toxic wastes or quarterly dividends. To reporters, they are derisively known as flacks, whose main duties consist of peddling press releases. But on Wall Street, with its steady flow of gossip and inside information, a score of public relations professionals have managed to achieve considerable power. Their rise is understandable. As the business press devoted more space to the great takeover battles of the 1980s, the importance of manipulating its coverage grew. By the end of the decade, each entrant into a takeover fight routinely hired a PR firm to work alongside its investment banker and attorneys. For years, Wall Street public relations has been dominated by a single firm, Kext & Company, and its well-connected founder, Gershon Kext. Kext spokespeople can be found in every major takeover, dishing dirt on that day's enemy alongside their formal routine press releases. It was on Gershon Kext's advice that Kohlberg Kravis managed to stay out of the headlines for nearly a decade. Then, in the late 1980s, came the first serious challenger to Kext's rule in years. Linda Robinson was no ordinary flack. She was a tall, willowy strawberry blonde with a knowing smile, a grueling work schedule, and an obvious love of gab. Raised in California, the daughter of the actor who played Amos in radio's famous Amos and Andy serials of the 1940s, she was a former debutante who spent the 1970s in a failed marriage and an array of jobs, including one at an acupuncture clinic. A diehard Republican, she finagled a job as deputy press secretary to Ronald Reagan's 1980 presidential campaign. Later, she went to work for a company run by the former transportation secretary Drew Lewis, where she met and married Jim Robinson. After she founded her own New York firm with a group of friends, Linda Robinson's affection for her husband began to be displayed publicly and regularly. "Isn't he cute?" she asked one female reporter, insisting that the woman fondle Jim Robinson's biceps. In no time, she became a force to be reckoned with, although she bristled at any suggestion that it was because she was Jim Robinson's wife. Her clients included Texaco, whom she advised in its drawn-out struggle with Carl Icahn, and Michael Milken of Drexel. Her friends included Tom Brokaw, Diane Sawyer, and Barbara Walters, and her attendance at the marriage of the Wall Street Journal's managing editor was noted by the paper's staff. At 35, the Journal observed in a front-page profile in 1988, she appears poised to wield a degree of behind-the-scenes influence approaching that of a few super lawyers and image-makers, invariably men. Hired by Ross Johnson within hours of his initial LBO announcement, Linda Robinson found her old friend's PR effort in disarray. It had no theme, no rhyme, no reason. The first week on the assignment, she spent keeping up with the avalanche of hostile phone calls. As the chief spokesperson for Johnson's management group, she was constantly on the phone, ladling out inside details to reporters. Her activist style quickly alienated Bob Baker, a genteel South Carolinian who was Solomon Brothers' senior public relations specialist. Baker thought Linda Robinson talked too much. He had argued against a New York Times piece Robinson had helped arrange that profiled Cohen and other Wall Street figures involved in the RJR and Philip Morris deals. "That's what you do when the deal is over," Baker insisted. "Linda, it's going to look like a bunch of silly fucking yuppies." Matters came to a head when Baker suspected Robinson was plotting to put Cohen on a Sunday morning news show, This Week with David Brinkley. The Solomon spokesman, trying to conjure a high profile for his own firm's deal-makers, had arranged for Solomon's Ron Freeman to appear alongside Ted Forstman, and didn't want his man replaced by Cohen. "Linda, we at Solomon are deferring to you because you work for management," Baker said. "Far be it from me to suggest that because you sleep with the chairman of American Express, you would tilt to Shearson's interest. On the surface, there would appear to be a conflict of interest here. I'm not suggesting that. This is not a threat. Just remember, there is life after this deal." Although she nearly lost her temper with Baker, Linda Robinson tried to avoid wasting time on bureaucratic squabbling. She had bigger fish to fry. The Robinsons led a busy social life, packed with formal galas of one sort or another. She joked that they tried to spend a night and a half at home together every 2 weeks. Among the Robinsons' closer friends were the Henry Kravises. The two couples' Connecticut spreads were only 20 minutes apart, and Linda had managed to get Kravis interested in the thoroughbred business. The two had just bought their first horse together. They had named it Trillion, although in the weeks to come Kravis would give it a nickname, Cookie Crumbles. Since Kravis first announced his bid, Linda Robinson had been quietly lobbying him to team up with Johnson. Linda has always cuddled up to Henry, says one of Kravis's aides. You have to understand these people. They all want to be friends with each other. So Henry starts getting calls from Linda every day, and he starts talking to her. She was playing matchmaker. Linda Robinson's conversations with Kravis were a closely guarded secret. Other than her husband and Johnson, only Steve Goldstone knew of them. Goldstone grew worried. Of all the Wall Street firepower at their disposal, was it wise to have a public relations person as the primary conduit to Kravis? Linda, you ought to be careful here, Goldstone ventured at one point. You don't want to be saying anything that the group hasn't agreed upon in advance. Linda Robinson told the lawyer not to worry. She knew what she was doing. Solomon's Ron Freeman, a veteran investment banker but no expert on LBOs, appeared pasty-faced and nervous as Sam Donaldson bore in for the kill on Sunday morning television. Talk about the morality, if you will, of what's going on with these LBOs, Donaldson urged. In the old days, companies were built to prosper and hire people and make a profit for the stockholders. Now, a lot of people get into this business simply to break up companies, to make the maximum money, and to leave town. Is that moral? I think that's not the only description of the LBO phenomenon, Freeman replied. Corporate restructurings occur to vast degrees of difference. For example, some of the largest and best-known corporations in the United States have restructured themselves with amazing success. Atlantic Richfield would be a good example of that. AT&T would be another. The extreme cases are only one small part of this overall restructuring movement. I grant you it's not the only description, Donaldson said, but there certainly are cases where people say in advance, we're going to get in there, we're going to break up the company, it's worth more in its separate parts than it is together, we're going to get the money, and we're going to run. Mr. Forsman, is that a good thing? Forsman's only condition before appearing on the Brinkley show was that he wouldn't discuss the RJR Nabisco deal. Although his interest had been reported in the newspapers, no one outside the talks knew how deeply involved he was. Well, sometimes that's a good thing to do, Forsman said. It's not always a bad thing to do. What about the workers, Mr. Forsman? Well, who are they anyway? I mean, if they're out of a job. No, that's not the point at all, Forsman said. Again, in my article, I said that without discipline, workers are one of the groups that may suffer. Investment discipline is the phrase that's got to come back and be talked about. In the beginning, the innovators of this idea, of whom I was one, had a great deal of discipline. What has happened is imitators by the hundreds have gotten into this business, and as imitators flocked in, discipline has eroded, and as a result, breakups that didn't make sense have occurred. I'm not pointing the finger at you, Donaldson said a moment later. I guess I'm pointing the finger at the people you yourself brought up, these so-called imitators. Now, why should they have a free ride with no regulation? Well, I don't think it's a free ride, and if we had more time and we could get into it, what's gone wrong here is that people have created a new source of money, which is commonly called junk bonds. After the taping, Forsman asked Freeman back to his apartment, and the pair watched themselves on television. Freeman called his mother-in-law. That other man on with you was so cute, she told the Solomon banker. Is he Jewish? Over coffee, Forsman brought up RJR Nabisco. His enthusiasm of the night before was beginning to wane. Ron, I don't know if we can get together. You guys are doing this all wrong. All these junk bonds, PICs and zeros, this and that, it's crazy. And what is this deal with Johnson? I just don't know, Freeman said. We're really not in control here. We're kind of silent partners. Well, here it is, the biggest deal of all time. And Kravis is going to take it. Thanks to a pileup on FDR Drive, Forsman was running an hour late when he arrived at Shearson that afternoon, accompanied by his brother Nick and Steve Frayton. The trio was escorted through milling groups of investment bankers to the boardroom, where they were joined by Peter Cohen and John Gutfriend. Forsman had tactfully left Boise behind. As they gathered, Forsman didn't know whether the day's talks would end with a joint agreement to fight Kravis or a one-way ticket out of the deal. Within minutes, the picture cleared. First, I want to say I misspoke last night. Cohen began the meeting. I was a bit confused. Let me give you the correct terms now. Cohen laid out Shearson's proposed capital structure. It was nothing like what he had suggested the night before. Among other things, Forstmann Little was to be junior debt rather than senior. The changes were enormous. Forstmann didn't believe Cohen had intentionally misled him. No one would do that, and chalked it up to inexperience. Well, Peter, this is quite different from what we talked about last night, Forstmann said when Cohen finished. Not that I hold it against you, it's just different. Yeah, I know. Ted Forstmann was the picture of accommodation, but inside he suspected this was the last straw. Still, Forstmann found himself listening as Cohen, for the first time, went through specific details of the management agreement. As Cohen explained it, each side seemed to have veto power over everything the other sides did. If he heard correctly, Johnson and his management team could practically veto their own firing. This is insane, Forstmann thought. The absolute amateurs of all time are playing in the World Series. They're putting up billions of dollars, and they can't even get rid of the management. And they actually think I'll do the same. When Cohen finished, there was a moment of silence. We think we can do a lot better, Goodfriend said. This is just where we are now. Solomon's chairman turned to Frayden. What do you think, Steve? Frayden thought Goodfriend and Cohen had no idea how their arrangement with Johnson would look to outsiders. They were missing the big picture. Because of the size of this transaction, Frayden said, I think there's going to be a tremendous amount of political and congressional scrutiny. I think that reaction is going to affect every institution in this room, and I think we ought to keep that in mind. He continued, By my calculation, this management contract is worth about $2 billion, is that right? No, Forstmann interrupted. That's not right. What he meant was, that can't be right. I think it is, Frayden said. Goodfriend looked around the room. Is that right? They totted up the numbers. If all the incentives were met, the deal could be worth as much as $1.9 billion. That certainly is a very big profit for management, Frayden observed. Yes, they agreed, it was. Cohen emphasized again that the agreement would need to be reworked. Tell me about the fees, Ted Forstmann said. Goodfriend chuckled. Oh, we knew Teddy would get to that. Cohen began reading. First came a success fee. Shearson and Solomon would receive $120 million if the takeover was successful. Next came a 5% fee paid to everyone who put up equity. What's that for? Forstmann asked. Oh, you get part of that, Cohen said. Oh, Forstmann said. Shearson was projecting an estimated $103 million in fees for auctioning off RJR Nabisco assets after the LBO. There was a fee, $23 million, for committing to the mezzanine debt. Forstmann Little would receive a $30 million fee for its share of the mezzanine debt. Forstmann thought the list would go on forever. He asked questions, but only pretended to write down the answers. At his side, Frayden had some questions for Cohen. Are you going to be getting a spread when you do the junk bonds to take out the bridge? The lawyer asked. Oh, yes, Cohen said. We get a 3.5% fee on that. That came to about $425 million. Frayden saw the Forstmann brothers exchanging bewildered glances. Is there a bridge fee? Frayden asked. Multi-billion-dollar bridge loans he knew don't come free. Cohen nodded. What the hell is that for? Forstmann asked. Jim Stern was standing in the corner. Shearson's junk bond chief looked as if he hadn't slept in a week. If you would like to take the risk on $1.5 billion, he said, we'd be delighted to let you take it. Forstmann didn't miss the sarcasm. He glared at Stern. I don't know who you are, but Peter, who is this guy? Forstmann was so mad he felt the blood drain from his face. Maybe you don't know who I am, he said to Stern, but you're talking about taking the underwriting risk on $1.5 billion. I'm talking about putting in $3 billion forever. Forsman's anger was rising, and no one in the room wanted to get him started on the spiel. Cohen intervened. Pointing to Stern, he said to Forsman, "You want him out of here? You want him to leave the room?" Forsman thought Cohen sounded like a mafia don. No, he said. He can stay. The fee discussion resumed. "Well," Frayden asked, "what about the bank fees?" "Yes, of course," Cohen said. "There's bank fees." Shearson was assuming payment of a 2.5% fee to its commercial banks, about $375 million. 2.5%, huh? It was Nick Forsman, rolling his eyes at his brother. 2.5%, Frayden repeated. It sounded like a lot of money. Cohen wasn't through. "And we've estimated $75 million for legal fees." He turned to Frayden. "So I guess you really want this deal to go through?" "Well," Frayden said, "that's not how I operate." At one point, Nick Forsman halted the proceedings. Hold it, wait a minute," he said. "Peter, what are we paying for this company? I don't understand this. If I'm calculating right, it seems to me you're borrowing too much money." When Nick Forsman ran the numbers, they didn't add up. If he heard right, Shearson proposed raising $19 billion after their down payment. But it seemed to need only $16.5 billion to buy RJR Nabisco. "It looks like we're raising $2.5 billion too much," Nick Forsman said. "Why are we doing that?" "Is that right?" John Goodfriend asked. Nick Forsman glanced over at Steve Frayden. He didn't need to say anything. Do these guys know what they're doing? They took a break. Nick Forsman retreated to a conference room to hash out the arithmetic with a dozen Shearson and Solomon bankers. His brother and Frayden caucused in a hall outside the conference room. To Frayden, it was obvious that Cohen's presentation left little room for agreement. Frayden returned to the room alone. "Look, Teddy may want to reconsider some aspects, including the fees, the capital structure, the Ross Johnson situation, and the governance issues. In short, everything. I'm also concerned that the preferred is a PIK preferred, which you may know he's never used." "Okay," Cohen said. Later, after Cohen and Tom Hill reviewed more of their strategy, the Forsmans walked outside to their waiting car. Frayden wondered aloud what their next step was. "Well," Ted Forsman said, "let's go uptown and call Boise and tell him where we are." "Where are we?" Frayden asked. "You know where we are, Steve," Forsman said. "We're out." Chapter 12. In one way, an LBO is a lot like buying a used car. A target company's annual report and public filings can be compared to a classified ad. Like an advertisement, they contain useful information, although a savvy buyer knows the numbers can convey anything a clever accountant needs them to. The car buyer wants to know more than just what's in the ad. He wants to talk to the owner, check under the hood, go for a ride around the block. For LBO buyers, a thorough inspection is equally crucial. More so than any takeover artist, the LBO buyer must know his prey. His success depends on determining exactly how much debt the target company can take on, and figuring precisely what budgets can be cut and what businesses sold to pay down that debt quickly. To take the used car analogy a step further, the LBO buyer must estimate in precise detail how many miles the car has left, how many spare parts he will need, and how much maintenance will be required. His margin of error is so thin that a worn crankshaft or a blown gasket could prompt the bank to call his loan. Similarly, in an LBO, a wrong calculation or an inaccurate projection can bring both buyer and seller down in an avalanche of debt. But what if you're Henry Kravis, and the fellows driving the car won't even let you kick the tires? This was the dilemma Kravis now faced. In a bidding contest, Johnson and Cohen would hold all the cards. Not only did they have access to every piece of confidential information, they had a management team to analyze it. They knew where every last dollar was stored, which budgets could be slashed without hurting the business, which plants could be mothballed without slowing production. Information was the key to success, and Kravis was on the outside looking in. One of the special committee's most important duties was helping Kravis learn about RJR Nabisco. The bankers of Lazard and Dillon were the referees charged with creating a level playing field on which Kravis, at least theoretically, could compete equally with Johnson. In practice, this proved a difficult task. The process by which LBO buyers inspect a target company is known as due diligence. When Kravis worked with a management group, due diligence was a breeze. Confidential documents were instantly produced, and executives were always available to brainstorm on the best ways to improve cash flows and reduce overhead. Kravis had teams of accountants, lawyers, and investment bankers crawl all over a target company until he was satisfied they knew its every nook and cranny and had earmarked every asset to be jettisoned, paired, or retained. It was a methodical, unexciting chore, but in many ways it was the key to Kohlberg-Kravis's success in the LBO business. On Thursday, October 27th, Kravis and Roberts had met with Charlie Hugel and received assurances they could promptly begin due diligence. RJR Nabisco executives, including members of Johnson's group, would be produced for interviews. Like many public corporations, RJR was chartered in Delaware, and under Delaware case law, the board was compelled to produce its executives for Kravis's scrutiny. But, as Kravis would find out, there was no law saying they had to be cooperative. The special committee had arranged for Kravis to begin interviewing RJR executives at New York's Plaza Hotel Monday morning, October 31st. The interviews would go on for 2 days. Johnson wouldn't be called. Fruitless, Kravis figured, and Ed Horrigan had refused. Kravis's team spent all weekend preparing. Johnson's executives were to run an unusual gauntlet. Kravis planned to greet each man in a sitting room, brief him on his firm's operating philosophy, and encourage him to stay on if Kravis won. Afterward, he would escort each executive to a separate room where he would be grilled by Paul Rather and a handful of Kohlberg-Kravis associates. Rather was in a foul mood even before the interviews began. The first boxes of RJR financial data had arrived from the special committee only that morning, giving him no time to prepare intelligent questions. At 9:30, the first executive, John Polychrone, president of Planters, appeared. When Kravis shook Polychrone's hand, he noticed a second man behind him, one of Harold Henderson's lawyers. Kravis, alert for signs of tampering or intimidation by Johnson, was immediately suspicious. Was the man a spy? Was he sent along to intimidate those interviewed and prevent them from spilling secrets? Kravis couldn't tell, and after a few moments the man departed, leaving Polychrone on his own. The next pair, John Grennis, the Nabisco head, and Bill McKnight, an aide, arrived at 1 o'clock. Kravis went through his speech, trying to make the pair comfortable. He was surprised when Grennis remarked, "Look, you gotta understand, I'm not part of the Ross Johnson group. I'm not one of these 7 guys." "Watch this guy," Kravis told Rather as he escorted Grennis into the interviewing room. "Maybe there's a wedge here we can use. He just might be helpful." Rather was hopeful as Grennis seated himself at the interview table. But just as they began, a young Lazard associate came in with a message. "When you're finished," he told Grennis, "you're supposed to go across the street to the 48th floor." It broke the mood. Rather suspected that the message from Johnson was meant to intimidate Grennis. It was all a mind game. Grennis, like Polychrone before him, went on to answer questions politely and appeared helpful, but not too helpful. Harold Henderson was scheduled to be questioned at 5 o'clock. Henderson, with his detailed knowledge of tobacco litigation, could be especially useful. A few minutes before 5, Kravis and Dick Beatty ran into him in the hall outside the interview room. The lawyer introduced himself and shook Kravis's hand. "Can I talk to you, Mr. Kravis, a minute?" The 2 men stepped into a vacant suite while Beatty waited outside. Kravis emerged from the room a minute later and watched Henderson walk off down the hallway. That's the damnedest thing I've ever heard. What? The guy made it absolutely clear. I'm with Ross, win, lose, or draw. He won't talk to us. That's the first time that's ever happened. By Monday evening, Rather was growing irritated. Johnson's men seemed to be suffering from collective memory loss. The easy questions they answered, but when Rather probed for a judgment, an opinion on where a budget could be cut, they clammed up with an, "I'll get back to you on that." The parade of Johnson executives continued on Tuesday. That afternoon, a trio of senior executives, led by the domestic tobacco chief, Dolph von Arx, came in. Von Arx had been quoted in the Wall Street Journal the day before, saying he would leave the company in the event of a Kravis takeover. As a result, Kravis had little use for the man. "You've undoubtedly heard most of what I have to say in these speeches," Kravis said. "And well, Mr. von Arx, there's not a lot to talk about with you. You're leaving, or so I read in the paper, along with your top 8 guys." "Oh no," von Arx protested. "Reread that quote. I'm not speaking for them. They have to make their own assessment." "Are you gone if I buy this company?" Kravis asked. "I'm loyal to management, as you would expect," said von Arx. "But I would have to reassess my position." Interesting, Kravis thought, how quickly these people switched allegiances. As for the others, a few, such as Bob Carbonell of Del Monte, were pleasant and mildly cooperative. Others couldn't seem to remember their names. Ed Robinson was the worst. Johnson's chief financial officer should have been a treasure trove of information. His intimate knowledge of the company's European and offshore funding operations could have been invaluable. Shown in on Tuesday at 5 o'clock, Robinson clearly wanted nothing to do with Kravis. Hostility radiated from the man like summer heat from a city street. "Do you want to hear what I have to say?" Kravis asked. "No," Robinson said. "I know enough." In the interview room, Robinson